Okay, so we're going to begin, and I'd like to say thank you to all of you who have joined us today. We have a wonderful webinar in store for you, and I hope that you enjoy it, and feel free to give us feedback at the end through the email address that you were sent the link upon. Today, this is a webinar hosted by the Colorado European Union Center of Excellence. We're at the University of Colorado in Boulder. I'm the Executive Director, Felicia Naranjo Martinez. Welcome. Today, the title of our chat, our webinar, is Climate Change and Energy Sustainability, Lessons to be Learned from the COVID-19 Pandemic. We are so honored to have panelists from the EU delegation joining us today. Mercedes Garcia Perez, who's the head of global issues and innovation at the delegation. We have Dr. Dagmara Kaska, who's a counselor for climate and energy, also from the delegation, and Irina Markina, who is the senior energy advisor, also at the delegation. And we're really grateful to you, KK Duvivier, from the Stern School of Law, at the University of Denver, for moderating this event. And we can get started. All right. KK, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Felicia, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. I'm going to start with a quote from Jules Kortenhorst of the Rocky Mountain Institute, because I think it embodies one of the things that I hope you'll take away from this session. It starts, as terrifying and destructive as this global health crisis is, it's just a preview of the increasingly severe disruptions that climate change will bring. When we do begin to emerge from this pandemic, humanity has a unique opportunity to build a better world, creating more sustainable systems that will provide more resilience to communities around the world and reduce the emissions that are driving climate change. So with that in mind, our panelists will be talking about several aspects of three key issues. The first one was highlighted by the quote. Does this moment give us an opportunity to see and experience what is to come with climate change? And if so, what are we to draw from that experience? The second thing is that we're already seeing that with COVID, that those already discriminated against, such as immigrants and homeless and prison inmates, are often being hit the hardest. And can we expand our discussions on environmental human rights to include the fact that climate change also affects all communities, but unfortunately, those discriminated against are often affected to a greater degree? And then third and finally, how can we assure that science is empowered and that expertise rather than simple politics will drive international public decision-making? So our panelists provide a European Union perspective on how to approach these questions and give us valuable insights about ideas the United States and the global community could share. In the past years, members of the US Congress have been promoting a Green New Deal. That would be a bold transformation of the US economy to tackle the twin crises of inequality and climate change. But the European Union is ahead of us. In November of 2019, the EU declared a climate emergency. And then in December of 2019, the European Commission outlined the European Green Deal. My first question then is going to go to Mercedes. Can you tell us what the European Green Deal means and how its goals and ambitions have been affected by the COVID pandemic?
Thank you, KK. It's a real honor to be here. I thank you so much to you and Felicia for allowing us to join your May 9th celebrations this week. You can see on the screen the European Green Deal, a summary of what it means. And it's really an overall EU strategy that was presented in December last year by the von der Leyen Commission, really responding to the wish of European citizens very clearly expressed at the last European Union elections in 2019, that gave a mandate, a very clear mandate to the European institutions to advance the green agenda and to ensure a green transition. The European Green Deal is both an industrial growth strategy which is meant to advance the ambition of the European Union to become climate neutral by 2050. The European Union really wants to be the first continent to become climate neutral. And for that, as you see on the screen, we really need to transform every bit of the European economy. And in doing so, we don't want to leave anybody behind. So there will be provisions made for those who are in more vulnerable positions, and in particular for those regions and populations that have been relying on the fossil fuels economy, and in particular coal regions, but also other professions that could be affected more by the transition than others. The different aspects of the Green Deal actually speak to the different areas of the economy that need to be transformed. Of course, first of all, we need to speed up our climate ambitions. And to respond partly to your question about how the coronavirus crisis has affected our green ambitions, I'm happy to say that those ambitions have not been affected. If anything, they've been reinforced. And one proof of it is that on 4th of March, the European Commission actually presented the first draft of a climate law, the European Commission being the only institution in the European Union that can actually present legislative action. There's many other ways in which our climate ambitions will be stepping up during the next few weeks and months. I'll also like to mention energy, because energy is one of the most important areas that we need to tackle in order to achieve our green ambitions. Energy is a big producer of CO2 and methane emissions. So we need to tackle that as a priority. It's also partly low-hanging fruit, because we can, by electrifying a lot of the energy and by producing energy with more sustainable sources, we will be able to contribute very quickly, hopefully, to climate change. We also need to transform the way we make our products. We need to transform the way we build our buildings. And we also need to transform the way we produce our food. And in that respect, there will be a, excuse me, a farm-to-fork strategy that will look at that aspect of how our production of agriculture contributes to climate change. Excuse me. And then, of course, another big area of transformation is transport. Our mobility is also a big contributor to our pollution, but also to our CO2 and other emissions. So it's important that we also transform our mobility by electrifying cars, but also in the long term by looking at other means of transport, by using more the train, and by extending what's called the ETS, the system of curbing emissions by the aviation sector to other sectors, possibly very soon to the maritime sector as well. So those are just a few of the areas where we have realized we need to transform our economy, and the Green Deal is the big agenda that puts all of that under the umbrella of Europe's green ambitions. It is, as I say, a growth strategy. We want to continue to produce jobs, and we want to be able to recover from the coronavirus crisis in a way that doesn't return to the old economy, but rather that in a way that pushes forward the green agenda. We, in so doing, as I said at the beginning, it's very important to us to take care of those communities that have been relying in the old economy. And that's why a just transition mechanism was created as well under the Green Deal. And the financing mechanisms in general will look in particular at the most vulnerable communities to ensure that everybody benefits from that green transition. There's a big chapter that we don't have the time to come into, but perhaps it will come up in questions about the financing of the transition. The Green Deal was also accompanied in January by a Green Deal investment plan that was announced at the same time as the Just Transition Mechanism. And the plan is to mobilize at least 1 trillion in sustainable investments in the next decade. And as I was saying before, we hope that in the recovery plans and incentives that will be coming up after to recover from the COVID crisis, this ambition and this level of financing could even go up. I'll leave it at that for the time being. Looking forward to your next questions.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. And as she mentioned, please, we do have the question and answer box open. So if anybody has questions, put those in, and we hope to get to those as time allows. My second question is for Dagmara. What's the status of transatlantic cooperation on climate and energy? And what new opportunities are emerging from the Green Deal? On the other hand, what challenges are we facing to seize these opportunities, and how can we overcome them?
Thank you, KK, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very honored to be speaking with you today, and I'm thrilled for the questions that come next. I'd like to maybe start by saying that what Mercedes has outlined as the EU Green Deal is indeed shaping very much the relationship that we will be having with our global partners. In fact, we very much have a whole of the government approach to tackling this crisis. I think our whole of the government approach is important, extremely important, in fact, because this is a multi-layered crisis that we are facing. We need to find comprehensive solutions, and we need to find them across several sectors of our economy simultaneously. And of course, that will also help us understand the full extent of some of the difficult political choices that we will be facing better if we look comprehensively at these issues. And so, indeed, let me now dive a little bit into what we've been doing on this front with the US partners. And you will understand from what I will be speaking about next is that indeed this whole of the government approach is something that is very relevant for us in dealing with our partners globally. So when we speak about transatlantic cooperation, in particular on climate and energy, I'd like to first of all list out the achievements that we've done in the area of energy. In the area of energy, we're looking back at a conversation with the US authorities, which is spanning back more than a decade. We've been decisively tackling a number of big challenges. And this in particular from the conviction that we share a lot of commonalities. In particular, we are attentive to energy security, to affordability of our energy to our industries and to our consumers. We also have a very deep conviction that transparency in global energy markets is crucial. And so building on those persistent commonalities, we've come up with an agenda which is rich, which is clearly not a one issue conversation, an agenda that is spanning conversations around and common solutions to issues such as energy security within the EU borders, outside of EU borders, at EU neighborhood areas, but also energy trade, energy investments. To give you an example of that very successful cooperation, we've just in 2020 realized that actually the US is the largest importer of LNG to the European Union, larger than those traditional suppliers such as Nigeria, Qatar, and even Russia. I'd like to say that every second cargo that in fact leaves the United States when it comes to LNG is in fact birthing 2020 in the European Union. And this is an example because we in fact have put into life also a business-to-business cooperation and investment discussions in the transatlantic context. And but even if we, at times of crisis such as COVID, we've continued our conversation. We were very quick in adapting to what is actually necessary that we tackle together. So we've had a number of conversations now, in particular with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission on responding to the COVID crisis in electricity markets. We're planning another one on more specifically dealing with resilience in electricity markets. We've had one also on global supply chains when it comes to raw materials necessary for the energy transition. Now, I'd like to maybe focus a few moments of your time, dear listeners, and focus on climate specifically. I think here I would like to say and recall that, that the first ever global climate accord, the Paris Agreement is in fact a joint success, a joint achievement of the EU and US. Our respective administrations have in fact stayed in close cooperation throughout the time after the Paris Agreement was agreed to spell out the details of operationalizing the Paris Agreement, making it practical, the so-called Paris Rulebook. And we indeed also have a now outstanding cooperation on the sub-federal level in the United States. I'd like to mention our cooperation with the US Climate Alliance, as you know, an alliance spanning 25 US states that are still committed to the pledge to advance the goals of the Paris Agreement. And also we have technical dialogues such as on resiliency to climate impacts. With states, but also with municipalities, we advance important conversation around sustainability. With municipalities and cities in the US, we discuss under the umbrella of the Global Covenant of Mayors. So as you can see that we have a number of very valuable avenues and conversation on a number of topics spanning climate and energy and sustainability in a broader sense. But if we need to strive regularly to, in fact, renew our cooperation, and we feel that the European Green Deal actually offers a number of opportunities to do so. And so we are now in the process of jointly identifying those areas, and I can tell you that they definitely will be devoted to trade and investment in energy and innovations, to sustainable finance, and also to energy security in terms of green transition. We are more specifically also very much interested in investments, the US investments in Europe. In particular, the US Development Finance Corporation has announced that it has $1 billion for at its disposal to invest in Europe's energy security. And as you know, electricity grids and energy storage are contributors, important contributors to Europe's energy security and diversification. So we are looking into cementing this transatlantic partnership even further with those cooperations. So there's plenty we agree on, but what are the challenges? I think it's a relevant question to ask today. I think one of the challenges that I identify for today's conversation is indeed that we do not seem to be having exactly the same levels of public support from the society at large to tackling climate crisis head on. And indeed, Mercedes has already hinted to it, we have a very strong mandate from our citizens. In fact, our barometers show that over 90% of EU citizens support effective and ambitious climate action. I sense that there is not such a support yet in the United States to climate action. And also I sense a lot of political polarization around the topic. Because of that, of course, there is a difference in political prioritization, at least at federal level, when it comes to tackling climate change effectively. And the second challenge I've identified for you to reflect upon is, in fact, the way we address tackling this crisis globally within the global community. So there we also have some divergent views. But the challenges of the energy transition are to a very large extent common. So I'm very hopeful that we will be able to embark on tackling those challenges together. Thank you, KK.
You're welcome. My next question now then is for you and Europe responding to the COVID crisis, and what implications of the COVID crisis have you observed in the energy space?
Thank you so much, KK, and also thank you for University of Colorado, in particular Felicia Martinez and yourself for putting together this event. We would much rather be meeting you in person, but we're very grateful for the opportunity that we can use Zoom technology to discuss these important issues with you. I think European Union, much like many governments around the globe when it comes to COVID, is flying the airplane as the wings are being redesigned. But I can say, hand on heart, that I am extremely proud on how the EU is responding to the COVID crisis. So, with something what has been quite a slow start for us to understand the challenges of the COVID-19, very quickly, European Union was requested by member state and responded swiftly So right now we have the EU assisting and playing a major role in terms of developing treatments, searching for vaccines, helping workers in member states stay afloat, facilitating trade, relaxing state aid measures. To give you one example, in a matter of weeks, right now, the EU has put together a package of measures that currently amounts to 3.4 trillion euros. This is a truly impressive and unprecedented figure. And the word unprecedented is really a key word and catchword for this crisis. To give you another example, just today, European Council has endorsed 3 billion in support to 10 neighboring countries, which includes the Balkan nations as an example and Ukraine. So not only we have an impressive package of measures to address issues internally, we're also supporting our neighborhood. Third example that I would like to share occurred just yesterday. Yesterday on May 4th, European Commission hosted a global pledging conference where we worked with civil society actors such as Gates Foundation, our partners UK, Norway, Canada, Japan. And we essentially secured a pledge of 7.4 billion euros, which is $8 billion, a really significant figure, and a figure that scientists think is necessary to kickstart the global response. When it comes to transatlantic cooperation, I can say that our ambassador likes to reflect on these issues. He reached out broadly, so we may say that we have active discussions at the transatlantic level, also happening through G7, G20. There is a new format that was proposed by United States, which also includes G7, Japan, and NATO. Their countries are discussing such issues as travel restrictions, repatriation of overseas citizens, coordination and stimulus packages. Then more specifically in the energy space, we had European Commission held crisis response internal coordination meetings, as well as meetings with industry and stakeholders. So we have specialized coordination working groups. We have one for oil, gas, electricity, and offshore energy. Each working group has met. As an example, the power sector working group met at least twice. And the major conclusion from that was that there was no specific risk to the security of energy supply. Of course, because of COVID, the energy demand and electricity demand has fallen significantly. So the key risk was really assessing the staffing operations and staffing in particular of control rooms in critical energy infrastructure. So there is a lot of internal European coordination that has happened. And then back to the energy space and transatlantic level, we also responded, I think, rather quickly. We adapted our dialogue with FERC and we discussed COVID responses and we compared notes with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. As my colleague Dagmara mentioned, we are planning on the 15th of May a dialogue with North American Reliability Corporation, which is responsible for their both power system reliability and long-term planning. So we're essentially firing from many cannons, and I think I'm truly proud of what the EU is doing in the wake of this crisis.
Great, Irina, thank you. I'm going to go back to you, Mercedes, and ask, what do you think that we can learn from the current COVID crisis that's applicable in the long-term climate crisis?
Thank you, KK. And I think this is a very interesting question and one that should guide a lot of our reflection in the near and long term. I think the first lesson that we can learn from the COVID crisis is that we need to put science at the forefront and we need to listen to science. And that's certainly applicable to COVID, and the solution to the COVID crisis will come from science, will come from a vaccine and treatments that will be researched by our researchers through international cooperation in some cases, and will also need to then be produced in a way that reaches everybody that needs it. The big difference between COVID and climate change is that in the case of COVID, the solution is probably in sight in the next, hopefully, few months to a year. We'll probably have a vaccine. Whereas in the case of climate, the solution is also in our hands, but we haven't yet do everything, and we're not ramping up all of the efforts that need to be put on the table to actually create a solution for this crisis. So my hope is that the conversation on science that is clearly stemming out of the COVID crisis will also extend to climate change. I think we're also learning lessons in resilience and in solidarity from the COVID crisis that will also come in handy for the climate crisis. We've dedicated a lot of efforts to compare notes, especially at the sub-federal level, as Dagmara has indicated before, about how do we deal with climate resilience in communities across the Atlantic. And I think COVID has made us all pause and think about the way we live and the way we operate, what we consume, etc. So I think in the long term, it will also have an effect on the personal attitudes towards climate. But I think more importantly, both crises require global cooperation. So both global crises, we like to say that we're doing everything we can to combat climate change in Europe, but we only produce 9% of the emissions. So clearly we're not going to be able to tackle climate change on our own. The same way that coronavirus cannot be solved by one single country or even by one single region, it requires global cooperation, and it requires everybody around the globe to recognize that both vaccines, remedies to this pandemic, but also climate change are global public goods that need to be protected globally, and that is by international institutions working cooperatively together. And the same way we came together to achieve the Paris Agreement. I think after this crisis, we will need to focus very intensely on climate change, which is not going to go away during the COVID crisis, and find the same level of global commitment to be able to succeed also in solving that other crisis.
Great, thank you. Irina, I'm going to turn back to you. What are the major risks for energy transition resulting from the COVID crisis? Do you think we can draw some lessons from the 2008-2009 economic and financial crisis?
Thank you for your question. I certainly think that to move forward, we need to look back and see what has happened in 2008-09 and what measures have been taken. When it comes to risks, I think this is my very personal view. I think there is a risk that the current trends and voices towards what some have called deglobalization could potentially have negative effects towards a global energy transition. As you may have heard, the current situation has affected renewable energy supply chains, and there were some voices in some countries essentially calling for renationalization of strategic assets and renewable energy supply chains. And I think this is truly a counterproductive to advance the partnership under a climate agreement. And if we want to achieve sustainable development goals that we have set at the UN level, or essentially ensure global decarbonization and movement away from fossil fuels, that is truly counterproductive. When it comes to lessons learned, I try to look back and, at the time when EU adopted its economic stimulus and United States adopted our Economic Recovery Act, and compare what actions each side has taken. So when it comes to the EU, we have put forth a 200 billion stimulus package, which at the time amounted to 1.5% of the EU's GDP. And there were quite significant energy and climate elements on the European agenda, and let me list a few of them. So there was a very strong focus of what was called at the time smart finance. So there was an interest to address climate change through smart finance. And the focus was, for instance, on green cars, where there was a 5 billion initiative. There was a focus on energy efficient buildings, where there was 1 billion foreseen. Also the factories of the future, laboratories of the future, so focus on R&D, over 1 billion investment. And I think if we compare our current response, we have truly put a European Green Deal at the center, and if not double down on some of our considerations that we had in 2008 and 2009. And if you look back at ARA and what the US has done in its economic stimulus, this has been a $800 billion huge economic package, which also focused on renewable energy and energy efficiency. I looked at some data and numbers on the Energy Department website, and I saw that the United States invested as much as $31 billion in renewable energy and energy efficiency projects. And while International Energy Agency has said that at a given moment in 2010, US's support to clean energy agenda within 2008 stimulus at some point amounted to 10 private investment funds. So we can say that at the time there was a quite significant focus. I think listeners and US citizens who are listening to this conversation will know better in terms of how money was invested and how effectively sort of what was the bang for the buck, as you say. But I think right now we observe that energy and climate is absent from the stimulus approach, and I think that's a major difference between EU and US. And there are a lot of assessments, but I think that we can say that there were a lot of positives that came out from the stimulus in 08 and 09. And I think that, this is truly the future where we should be looking at, because currently politicians, policymakers, governors, European leaders, they're making decisions that will lock in choices for decades to come. So I think it is a time to articulate a vision, a bold vision with specific actions towards the future where we want to go. And I believe EU is doing precisely that.
Great, thanks, Irina. And Dagmara, to expand on that, because Irina is saying that the current COVID response in the United States doesn't include renewable energy, how can we use the COVID crisis, in particular the economic recovery efforts that are underway, to turn them into this opportunity for climate change and clean energy transition that we hope?
Thank you, KK, for this excellent question. I think from the outset, I would like to start saying that, as the world battles the coronavirus crisis, we should be under no illusion that, climate crisis and biodiversity loss are going away. They are not. And climate crisis is still one of the most existential threats that we are facing as a planet. We should not lose sight from the need to actually and a task to significantly reduce our greenhouse gases emissions within the next decade. So that I would like to kind of place up front. But the second thing that I'd like to bring to your attention when responding to your question, KK, is one figure. 70% of global energy investments are driven directly or indirectly by governments. This is according to the latest IEA analysis. I think it's relatively telling, and it's also telling why the EU and so many global partners and institutions are indeed concerned about the destination of those trillions of euros of recovery cash flowing as we speak and in the next days and weeks. And those could either curb emissions or they could supercharge them. So in Europe, we seem to be having an investment gap, which would be very close to 1 trillion euros. So this is a huge investment gaps. What to do with it? So there are, like with every crisis, several opportunities that emerge, and the opportunity, the most compelling opportunity in the current situation that I see, break with old sustainable habits. So instead of just restoring the old ways, we could actually build a completely new economy in society, an economy in society built on circularity and on resilience and sustainability. It would have a lot of health effects, and it would have the effects of helping our societies, because simply we would be able to offer them skills that they're not having right now. So with this approach, which the Commission has been taking, and my colleagues have already said that there's a lot of thinking going on, I'd like to say that in fact, we have received a lot of support for a recovery package in Europe based around two pillars, namely the EU Green Deal and digitalization. We have received the support from the highest corners of our leadership, namely the EU Council. These are heads of state and government. We have received support from environmental ministers from many, many EU member states. We have received support that UKK quoted before from the European Parliament, but also the international organizations such as the International Energy Agency, such as IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, such as the IMF have supported this vision. And most importantly, our industry players have supported this vision as recently as last week during the Petersburg climate dialogue. So I would like to recall a number of elements that I think the Commission will unveil very soon in the context of the recovery package. These elements are self-explanatory simply because they make economic and social sense. So first of all, I think the first element of our recovery strategy will be around renewable energies and clean technologies such as hydrogen. Indeed, we see that these are massive economic and industrial opportunities that lie in renewable energies. And in fact, according to recent estimates, jobs in renewable energies could reach 42 million globally by 2050. This is 4 times the size of the employment in the renewable sector today. And I think the important difference with this crisis is that the cost of renewable technologies, wind and solar in particular, have come down so dramatically. So those technologies are simply in a better shape to drive the transition today than they were 10 years ago. Secondly, energy efficiency. In particular, energy efficiency in buildings is still a low-hanging fruit. So indeed, the European Commission will unveil very soon a renovation wave strategy built around, how to go about renovations of Europe's buildings. And here again, a lot of job potential. These jobs are, sectors are labor intensive in particular, and some estimates, recent estimates that I've seen are saying that in particular 21 million jobs could be created in energy efficiency space and around 50 million jobs in electricity system integration. The third element that I would like to mention is transport. Transport is today in some geographies responsible for the highest proportion of greenhouse gases emissions. It hasn't been really decarbonized to date. And this is one element we definitely will be looking into as we speak about the recovery package. And the fourth element is agriculture. Agriculture, because it's important both for this crisis, but also for the climate crisis. And so far, again, sustainable solutions are not yet there and available to the market. So I think with this, I'd like to pass it back to you, KK.
Thank you. And I see that you're answering some of the questions that people have come up. For instance, what about building new buildings? And you have a plan for how to renovate old buildings. So that's great to hear some of that. Mercedes, I'm going to come back to you. How can the EU and the US fight the COVID pandemic and climate change while remaining true to their values? So now we're getting to the human rights question. Should health and environment be considered global public goods?
Thank you, KK. And yes, I think I've already mentioned in my previous question that certainly health should be considered a global public good, but we also need to put the elements on the table. And there was already a lot of progress after the last SARS epidemic. And that's why, for example, countries like South Korea and others in Asia were so well prepared because they had developed during that time the necessary laboratories and the testing routines that were widespread. So they were well prepared. And I think we will learn a lot of lessons from this pandemic that we can apply. But let me say, going back to your question about human rights, is that fighting COVID is really a battle to save lives, simply, and to protect our health. And of course, without the right to life, you cannot really exercise the rest of your human rights. So it really goes back to basics as far as it can go in terms of human rights. To exercise the right to health, you need information. and you need a good access to healthcare. So those two big areas are going to be put and are being put at the forefront. There's a lot of misinformation and disinformation circulating during this crisis. And I think that's a very important part of the conversation that we're having with the US in both in the G7 and NATO forums that Irina was mentioning before, and also bilaterally. And in this case, disinformation can actually kill. So it is very, very serious. And our Commissioner for Industry and Growth, Mr. Breton, has reached out to some of the major US digital companies, and we're actually very pleased that most of the online big platforms are taking this very seriously and are being very forceful about putting out deleting posts that can really be harmful and that could lead to harmful situations. Now, the other thing where there's a huge connection between COVID and climate change is that protecting health also depends on access to food, safe food and sustainable food, as Dagmara has just signaled. It's also very much linked to climate change. If we want to combat climate change, we need to change the way we produce food. And if we want to protect our health in the long run, we also need to make that more sustainable. And of course, the access to safe drinking water and sanitation is also linked to climate change, because as we know, one of the big effects of climate change is desertification and the lack of water, which in turn also creates more migration linked to lack of access to water and other essential resources. So it's very interesting when you dig a bit deeper down that all of this is linked together. And as we've mentioned before, all of the, if you put a human rights lens to this, you realize everything is connected, and the solutions to this crisis are also connected. And therefore, this crisis, as difficult and sad as it is, also indeed provides an opportunity to having a new beginning and doing things better in a way that will also help us tackle climate change. The other connection I wanted to mention, which you did in your introduction very ably, is that both this crisis and the climate change crisis affect, in a disproportionate manner, communities who are also vulnerable in the first place. And in getting, in sort of devising the instruments to overcome the crisis, we need to be particularly mindful of the necessities and the needs of those communities to make sure that nobody's left behind, first in the recovery from COVID and then also in tackling climate change.
Great, thank you. And Dagmara, then, a lot of these goals are similar to what seems like the Green New Deal in the United States. So how are you building credibility and understanding in the United States for the EU's ambitious climate policies and their human rights issues under the EU Green Deal, and specifically climate neutrality?
Absolutely, KK. Well, I think there are two tracks that you can basically pursue to build credibility for your ambitious policies and also for the climate neutrality. First, by an active leadership, and I think here the European Union is indeed trying to lead by example in particular and inspire leadership. And secondly, what is extremely important to do is in fact provide support, basically practical support, sometimes technical support, political support, and I think these two considerations have been driving a lot, my outreach indeed and my work here in the United States. And in particular, I'd like to bring you some example of that work. I think, first thing, I was indeed engaged very much in explaining the shift that has happened and has been happening in Europe already since, I would say, June last year, because that's when President von der Leyen actually pledged to be, elected president of the European Commission on the green credentials. That was #1 priority for her, and that's when actually our work around, the EU Green Deal started here in the United States. And the second important thing for me that I was pursuing was to build bridges. So indeed, building bridges is not always an easy task, but I think it starts indeed, like I said, with explaining. But we've been explaining what is happening not only to our counterparties in the administration, but we reach out actually quite widely in hope that we can reach quite widely. So we've reached out to Congress, in particular, Irina and me, we've had a number of opportunities where we in fact briefed Congress staffers, senior staffers around the different policies, around the different technical issues that we are dealing with in Europe, and the challenges which we've come across, and how we've been tackling those. I think it was important for those hands-on working on legislation to understand those. And then we've been also creating links to the civil society to explain and what we're doing and look for commonalities. I think we've been also working with industry and media. In fact, I mean, when it comes to media, we've been explaining also some of the most controversial elements of the European Green Deal. You might have heard about the carbon border adjustment discussion. So this is something that definitely has been, echoed quite broadly and widely here in the United States. I was engaged in a number of conversations, closer, opener formats when I was giving, contribution to the discussion around this topic. And then, of course, we are, like I said, expanding the areas of cooperation with the administration at the federal level. I've mentioned already a couple of those. I'd like to be maybe more specific now that I have time to develop those. I mean, one element is offshore wind. For us, for the European Union, if we are successful with our decarbonization and electrification goals, we need to place a lot of emphasis on offshore wind. So this was one conversation that actually already started almost a year ago with the BOEM, which is a Bureau of Ocean Energy Management at the Department of Interior. We've started a dialogue with BOEM, and we've now looking back at a number of exchanges which have been extremely useful for both sides. That was one. I mentioned already climate resilience with the US Climate Alliance, and I'd like to also mention energy-related methane emissions. Methane emissions being such a big problem, given that this is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. It's a short-lived pollutant, but extremely potent, as I said. So we've just had a very productive workshop with the US industry across the board, across different sectors, upstream, midstream, downstream, with technology providers that were extremely insightful. And I think what I would like to mention last is, the outreach to the wider public. How do we do it? Well, first of all, we try to obviously come together in person, and there was a number of large-scale events that I organized already in that space on various topics, smart cities, and also the Paris Agreement and multilateralism, a number of really interesting conversations we've been having. But now that we're confined to our rooms and houses, apartments, attics, we need to kind of think about more creative ways. So I've just run a digital campaign on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which was about showcasing what our EU member states are doing in the climate and sustainability space. It was very large, about circular economy, about transport, about research and innovation, about environment, clean air, planting trees. And we've come up with an infographic, every member state basically showcasing one example of how they are diverse in action, but unified in the overall target of reaching climate neutrality by 2050. So these are the different ways I operationalize those credibility building that is necessary to be successful on the global stage as the EU.
Sounds like you're very busy even when you're sequestered at home.
Indeed.
We have several questions, but I want to have one final one for Irina. What future trends do you see accelerating because of the COVID crisis, and what do you think we should be watching?
Question. I also, speaking of questions, I saw one that focused on LNG. So I really want to make sure we answer that because it relates to our current work on methane. When we think about the future, I think it's a very pertinent question. And I think, you know, there are as many opinions as there are energy gurus, in particular in Washington, but I am specifically watching two trends. One is digitalization. If you look at the European Green Deal, it encompasses 8 major sectors of the economy. So we cover agriculture, finance, you know, energy sector, research, oceans, environment. So there, everything is covered. However, digitalization, I think there is still a space to flesh this out a little better. And if we look at the European digital economy strategy, it already has some placeholders and provisions when it comes to digital tech. Specifically, there is a mandate for ensuring that the data centers reach carbon neutrality by 2030. And the reason why I raise digitalization is because digitalization, I think that energy sector is currently at the cusp of digital era. It is, you know, electricity sector is at the heart of the digitalization. Transportation sector will be very significantly transformed with automation, given the connectivity and availability of the data. This is certainly a one space where also Commission has put forth as a second pillar of our recovery. So we have mentioned and we had focused on the Green Deal, but digital economy and digitalization is the second pillar that we see as one of the main issues for our way out of COVID. So I would certainly be focusing on that area. And second issue is sustainable finance. This is an issue that was less touched upon in our current conversation. I think when I hear BlackRock doubling down on their climate commitments during the crisis and the climate commitment that was just made in January at the World Economic Forum, I certainly pay attention to that. I believe that increasingly climate-related financial risk disclosure, which by the way, already there are voices in terms of inclusion of these issues in the US stimulus. There was a conversation in Congress on these topics. I think that this will only grow in importance, and EU is taking very significant steps on these issues. As you know, we have launched essentially an international global coalition on sustainable finance. There is a sustainable finance taxonomy being developed by the EU, and recently a working group has met and essentially only more supported the movement towards that direction. And another sort of data point on this is the recent change of the European Investment Bank's lending policy. And I think that down the road, we could potentially see this movement with other multilateral development banks. So I would say digitalization and sustainable finance and increasing movement of the private sector towards that direction are the two trends that I'm watching. I also want to encourage all of the listeners or all of our audience to look into a speech that our Energy Commissioner Kadri Simpson gave today. And she essentially outlined 3 major trends, 2 of them which have been mentioned by my colleagues. One was energy efficiency, offshore wind, but also system or sector integration. And I think that this could be another sectoral trend that will increasingly be very important for Europe, because European Union will be announcing a sector integration strategy, essentially looking for synergies between electricity sector and transportation, or electricity and gas, and trying to promote clean energy technology such as renewable hydrogen, the one that hasn't been yet mentioned. So I would say when we want to look in terms of future trends, read the speech of our commissioner. I think it gives out all.
Great. At this point, I'm going to ask all of the panelists to unmute themselves, and I will ask the question so that I'll let whoever feels they know what they want to answer jump in, okay? And we can also have more than one of you answer. So one question I see here is, how will the EU Green Deal change the economic and social performance measures? Will GDP become obsolete, for instance, or can you give a few details about the circular economy component?
I am happy to tackle the circular economy component very briefly. We also managed during COVID to publish the second edition, so to say, of the Circular Economy Action Plan of the European Union. So that identifies a number of sectors as a priority, such as textiles, for example, that need to make an additional effort to become part of the circular economy. Basically, we cannot continue to have a system where we produce in a way that takes away but doesn't give back to our planet. And by having products longer in our system, and by making sure that the producers think about the product not only in terms of how you use it, but also how you then recycle it or repair it. And even there's a right to repair concept within this action plan that is quite interesting. So coming up with solutions that will ensure that our products have a longer life, that they can be repaired, and that they are produced in a way that doesn't take too much is important to us, and is one of the contributions to the Green Deal that we are working on at the moment.
Okay, if I may maybe add a little bit on those performance indicators, because I think we've been quite successful in the European Union in trying to measure progress according to different performance, various actually performance indicators. I think one performance indicator for us was always a GDP. I mean, clearly we wanted to test also this decoupling that we've been starting to be seeing in the European Union, decoupling of GDP growth from in fact, the greenhouse gases emissions. So while our greenhouse gases were falling, we now reached over 20% between 1990 and basically 2018. Our growth rate has been tremendous. It's been over 60% of GDP growth. So that was one indicator that we've been always looking at, and I think it will continue to be that way. I don't think that this is an indicator that it will become obsolete. But other indicators we've been extremely paying attention to were the growth and jobs potential. So in particular, the number of jobs that could be happening because of some reforms that we were doing. And so that was something which was much more difficult to look into the future, because basically you would be looking into a crystal ball. But still we were trying to do this through various studies. As you know, every proposal that the European Union is coming up with is actually very thoroughly impact assessed. And so these indicators, jobs in particular, were used. Then we had also such indicators as transport. So for example, we would be measuring, what is the likely outcomes on the number of electric vehicles, for example, number of electric charging stations and so on, being developed as a follow-up to any given, for example, mobility proposal that we've produced. So in fact, if you look into the impact assessments that we've done, we've number of very successful indicators beyond and above a particular growth.
If I may add towards the indicators, the 2008 and 9 stimulus was already built on the green jobs agenda. In fact, the green jobs was the key focus, and I think the similar focus was here in the United States. I think the one important thing is to note that International Renewable Energy has said that the past recovery has been globally greenhouse gas intensive recovery. So our responses globally still have not reduced emissions. And so I think this time around, we have an opportunity to even more pay attention towards greenhouse gas emissions reduction as we implement the new.
So the next question is the EU going to bail out certain industries, such as airlines? And if they do, are they going to have certain conditions tied to that?
So there is this discussion, of course, in Europe as to, and there's been a lot of conditions around the state aid that is typically prohibited by European competition law that have now been lifted, because of course part of these stimulus packages will be about recovering that are needed to recover the economy. Will be about rescuing some of those companies that are key to our global economic growth. But of course, in Europe, we will certainly want to attach some conditions to the way those stimuli are taken forward by the states and the companies. So indeed, green growth is the way we want to go. So if we're giving away money to companies, we will also do it in a way that encourages them to contribute to green growth.
If I may add, KK, and for instance, for the airline sector, the European airline sector is already included under European emissions trading system, and European Green Deal has essentially provisions incorporated that airlines would be getting fewer amounts of allowances. So this was already built in the European Green Deal strategy even before the COVID-19 crisis for this particular sector.
So another question is, along with large-scale investment in electrifying transportation or other energy-intensive sectors, must we also reduce the amount of energy used? So is the EU seeing continual growth, or can we reduce consumption maybe by returning food and consumer good production to local sources?
Maybe I can answer that. I think we see a lot of advantage in local production, and I think you've been seeing a development around local smart grids in Europe, and about prosumers producing their electricity. This is indeed a core of our reforms called electricity market design that we've been, in fact, introducing already a couple of years back, that are now actually finally implemented also in the legislation at national level. So clearly we see an advantage of those local solutions, and that wasn't really affected, I think, by the crisis. While we see those advantages of local solution, we still cannot lose sight of those kind of larger scale infrastructure needs that we need in order to be able to tackle the transition. In fact, for example, if you look at Europe, it's such a big economic bloc, but it is only effectively working if the internal market is working effectively, if we are able to trade all products, and also in particular energy products across the borders. So we need to see about what bottlenecks there are in particular. But again, another example of why this is helpful for the transition, and in particular for the energy transition, is that you have those large production centers of renewable energies, in particular in the North Sea, for example, or in the north of Europe. Some of the parts are extremely, for example, very, very good, have a great potential for wind, but production centers are not necessarily close to consumption centers. So by building those larger infrastructure projects, transmission grids over longer distances, you are actually connecting those consumption centers with the production centers and making the whole market work more efficiently.
Right, we have some of those same issues in the US, that all the wind's in the middle of the country and the load centers are at the coast and things. We have time for one last question, and Irina, you had said you were interested in answering about how do you reconcile increased importation of LNG with commitment to the climate crisis, since the production and transportation of fracked gas and LNG releases significant amounts of methane. So I'll start with you on that, and anyone else can jump in.
I just think that it's a question that we often see pop up, and some say that it is essentially European policies disingenuous, but I wanted to say that, European energy and climate agenda is built on 3 priorities, which is energy security, competitiveness, and sustainability. And so while we are still importing, and we have an excellent trade relationship with the United States, and we're importing LNG, and as Dagmar mentioned, the United States is our largest LNG essentially exporter to the European Union, we are simultaneously addressing the carbon footprint of the fossil fuels in our economy. So I think that was just important to point out, because some of these tougher questions sometimes don't get looked at. And I wanted to add towards a question on reducing the imperative of reducing energy demand that was posed earlier. As Dagmara and Mercedes mentioned, energy efficiency will be a very important element of the recovery plan. European Commission plans to announce a renovation wave. And I think this will significantly help to curb the domestic energy demand, because our building sector currently accounts for 40% of energy that we consume.
Great. So I wanted to give each panelist a couple minutes to wrap up. I don't know if we might not get to all the questions there, but just in closing, I was going to say that I was inspired by something that the president of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, said. She said, we should not be shy about being proud of where we are or ambitious about where we want to go. So basically, you know, we need to take bold action right now. And I think this is an opportunity to take that action. So I'd like to give each of the panelists, 2 minutes to wrap up any of their remarks. And I'll start with you, Mercedes.
Thank you, KK. I wanted to echo that reflection, and also indeed say once again that as hard as this crisis is certainly also an opportunity to develop a better understanding of what should be our global priorities and what issues should be considered as global public goods. That should certainly include the climate and health and the remedies towards this pandemic and others to come. And I will also not miss the opportunity to invite you all and all our audience to the celebration of 9th of May, which is Europe's Day, as you know, this Saturday, which we're celebrating 70 years of the European Union. And we want to continue to celebrate the motto, united in solidarity, and in these times of coronavirus, particularly in solidarity with frontline health workers and other workers that are literally saving our lives every day. We will be doing this online, obviously, observing our distances as of 10 o'clock this Saturday. You can join us either in the Facebook at EU in the US, or through the link in our Twitter page. You're all very welcome. Thank you once again for the opportunity.
Yeah. Irina, how about you? Wrap up?
Sure. I guess I reflected on past stimulus approaches, digitalization, sustainable finance, future trends that we should be looking at. And I want to close by saying that we have an opportunity to think big and to articulate a vision, because the current choices will lock in technologies for decades to come. And I think that Europe is doing precisely that.
Okay, Dagmara.
Sure. KK, I think I'd like to start by saying in particular that we actually never wanted a lesson on decarbonization and cleaner air, which condemned so many of us to suffering, and our fellow citizens are dying. I mean, this is definitely not a lesson we wanted to have, but as we are tackling this crisis, we actually should not lose sight of the fact that another crisis is just around the corner. And in fact, tackling those two challenges together makes absolutely sense. It is the only responsible way forward. It is economically viable and societal. This is a societal opportunity, like I outlined before. And I'd like to kind of say also that as we tackling this crisis, we should not forget about the equitability of what we're doing and about the just transition. We haven't spoken a lot about this today, but be rest assured that this is really at the center of Europe's thinking. And I think with that in mind, I think there are 4 prerequisites from my point of view when it comes to a structured way of out of this crisis and away from the next crisis. And this is the need for intensified international cooperation, B, definitely a more coordinated financial mobilization around the globe, C, strengthened global institutions, and definitely B, a broader policy cohesion around the globe. And I think, again, the EU wants to lead the way, but we would appreciate if the United States is a co-pilot with us on this endeavor. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that sentiment at the end, and I think many of us in the United States would like to be co-pilots, so I appreciate that.
And
Well,
you
as
are.
a law professor, I'm always very respectful of my students' time, and I don't hold them over for class, but I think we're actually have plenty of time. But I'm going to hand it back to Felicia in just a minute, and if she wants to ask you more questions, she can, but she's also going to give you some, closing remarks and I think information. I also want to have one other pitch. I am editing a book on renewable energy law, so if anyone in the audience either has written an article that's already been published or has been influenced by an article that you think ought to be in a collection, I would love for you to send those, ideas to me. And I don't know if you don't get the links through this program, it's kkduvivier@law.du.edu. So I would hope people would send those to me if you have any ideas. So, I think the more we can get great minds together and the more we can get these ideas out there, and the more progress we can make. So with that, I want to thank Felicia for all of her work in organizing all of us together and give her back the program.
Great. Thank you all so very much. This has been an extraordinary program, and we thank our speakers from the delegation. You, KK, thank you for jumping on board to moderate this. And listen, if anybody in the audience is interested in getting in touch with KK, I'm happy to pass those over through our CEUCE email address. So that should work really well. Let's see, is there anything else that we need to address? Well, I do need to thank our audience. Thank you so much for joining. We appreciate your attention. We appreciate your joining in, your participation. It's awesome to be able to deliver these sorts of discussions, sort of discussions. I mean, you're getting a lot more information, but we did open it up to questions, and we're very grateful to your coming. We do have another webinar coming this Friday from a group of EU fellows who are actually from the Commission in Europe, in Brussels, and we would invite you to come to that as well. A recording of this session will be on our website starting next week, and we invite you to come and listen again if you have ideas or things that you want to rehear. That would be great. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, KK. And that's it.
Everyone be well.
Thank you, Felicia. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for questions. Thank you for your organization. Thank you. It was excellent.